The fluorescent lights of the San Diego Veterans Affairs Office buzzed with that particular frequency that settles behind your teeth and stays there. A low, constant hum that most people learn to ignore after a few minutes. Mara Elise Kessler was not most people. She had spent 26 months in Afghanistan where every ambient sound could be the difference between living and breathing and not. The hum of a generator that suddenly stopped might mean a power failure, or it might mean someone had cut the line before an attack. The distant whine of a motorcycle engine could be a farmer heading to market, or a suicide bomber accelerating toward a checkpoint. Her brain had been rewired to catalog every sound, assign it a threat level, and file it away for future reference. That rewiring did not come with an off switch. She had been standing in the reception area for 3 minutes, clutching a manila folder against her chest like body armor, watching the second hand on the wall clock tick forward with the kind of excruciating slowness that made her wonder if the battery was dying. The clock read 10:22. Her appointment was at 10:30. She was early because she was always early. In the field, late meant dead. 28 years old. 5'4". 130 pounds of lean muscle that had started to soften in the 14 months since her discharge. Shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that she could have done in her sleep, and often did muscle memory from years of pre-dawn wake-ups when there was no mirror and no time to care. She wore jeans and a plain gray sweater that covered her from wrist to waist. No patches, no pins, no bumper sticker patriotism stitched into her clothing. Nothing to announce to the world that she had earned her place among the warriors scattered across the worn plastic chairs of this waiting room. And they were warriors. You could see it in the way they sat, the way they held themselves, the way their eyes tracked movement near the entrance. Baseball caps stitched with unit patches from wars that spanned 7 decades. Worn field jackets displaying campaign ribbons and deployment locations that read like an atlas of American foreign policy. Weathered hands that had held rifles and radios, and the hands of dying friends in places most Americans could not find on a map and did not want to. A heavy-set man near the window wore a cap that read USS Enterprise. Beside him, 2 younger veterans compared notes about benefit claim numbers, their voices carrying the particular frustration of people who had traded years of their lives for a system that now required them to prove they deserved help. In the far corner, a man in his 40s sat with his eyes closed, either sleeping or practicing the kind of deliberate stillness that combat veterans develop when the world gets too loud. Mara fit among them the way a whisper fits in a thunderstorm, present but undetected. She had learned invisibility during her deployments, the art of moving through space without drawing attention, of being the smallest person in a room full of operators who averaged 6 feet and 200 pounds. In Afghanistan, that invisibility had been a professional asset. Here in this government waiting room, surrounded by fellow veterans, it had become her greatest burden, because no one looked at Mara Elise Kessler and saw a combat veteran. No one looked at her and imagined the dust of Helmand Province caked in the creases of her knuckles, or the weight of a wounded SEAL operator draped across her shoulders as she ran through hostile terrain, or the sound of her voice cutting through the chaos of a firefight to tell a dying man that he was not dying today. They saw a young woman in jeans and a sweater, perhaps a wife here to file paperwork on behalf of her husband, perhaps a daughter helping an aging father navigate the bureaucracy, perhaps someone who had wandered into the wrong building altogether. The receptionist finally looked up from her computer screen. Her nameplate read Brenda. Mid-50s graying hair pulled into a severe bun, reading glasses perched on a nose that had processed 10,000 claims and remembered none of them. The kind of government employee who had long ago replaced empathy with efficiency and considered it an upgrade. "Can I help you?" It was not really a question. The tone suggested that Brenda was already thinking about her lunch break, already calculating the minutes until she could escape this fluorescent purgatory for 30 minutes of silence and a sandwich from the break room refrigerator. Mara slid her appointment letter across the counter, along with her military identification card. The folder stayed pressed against her chest. She was not ready to open it yet. Not until she needed to. "I have a 10:30 appointment for my disability evaluation." Brenda picked up the ID card with 2 fingers, the way someone handles a document they expect to be incorrect. Her eyes moved from the small photograph on the card to Mara's face, then back to the card. The photograph showed a younger Mara in navy dress uniform, hair pulled tight, eyes staring straight at the camera, with the particular intensity of someone who had recently returned from a combat zone and had not yet learned how to soften her gaze for civilian consumption. The frown that creased Brenda's forehead was a thing Mara had seen before. Different offices, different cities, different faces wearing the same expression. A frown that said something does not match that the information being presented conflicts with the assumptions being made that the world is supposed to work a certain way, and this young woman is not fitting into the expected pattern. Is this your husband's appointment? The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of assumption spreading outward. Brenda's voice had shifted to that practiced blend of sympathy and suspicion that government employees perfect over years of separating legitimate claims from fraudulent ones. You will need power of attorney paperwork if you are filing on his behalf. I can give you the forms, but you will need to come back with the proper documentation. The knot in Mara's stomach tightened. She had anticipated this conversation, had rehearsed her response during the 40-minute drive from her apartment near the coast, practicing the words aloud in her car, with the windows up so no one at red lights would think she was losing her mind. But preparation did not make it easier. Preparation never made anything easier. It just made you more aware of exactly how difficult the thing was going to be. No, ma'am. That is my appointment. I am the veteran. Brenda's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline with the slow deliberation of someone who has just been told something they find genuinely implausible. She examined the ID card more closely, squinting at the small print through her reading glasses, tilting the card to catch the overhead light. Mara Elise Kessler, Navy. Her finger traced the text like she was reading Braille. This says you were stationed at Naval Special Warfare Command. She looked up, confusion mixing with doubt, mixing with the first traces of something harder, something that looked like the beginning of an accusation. That does not seem right. The waiting room had been filled with the ambient noise of veterans passing time. Quiet conversations about VA benefits and service-connected disabilities. The rustle of outdated magazines. The occasional cough or cleared throat. The soft percussion of someone tapping their foot against a chair leg. Now that noise began to fade as heads turned toward the reception counter. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a room goes quiet when something interesting starts to happen and people want to hear what comes next. Mara could feel the weight of eyes settling on her shoulders. Each gaze adding pressure like hands pressing down on her trying to push her into a shape she did not fit. There is no mistake, ma'am. She kept her voice steady. Professional. The voice she had used when reporting to commanding officers who outranked her by decades and doubted her by instinct. The voice she had used when calling in medevac coordinates while rounds impacted close enough to throw dirt into her mouth. A voice calibrated for exactly this kind of situation, where emotion was the enemy and composure was the only weapon she was allowed to carry. I served as a hospital corpsman, attached to SEAL Team 3 for 2 deployments to Afghanistan. My specialty was trauma medicine and tactical field care. Brenda set down the ID card and turned in her chair. Greg, she called toward the back office. Can you come here a minute? A man in his early 40s emerged from behind a partition. Glenn Nolan wore a navy blue polo shirt with the VA logo embroidered on the chest. He had the build of someone who had once been fit, but had settled into the comfortable thickness of middle age, the kind of body that happens when desk work replaces physical training and lunch meetings replace morning runs. His expression was professionally neutral as he approached the counter. The face of a man who dealt with problems all day and had learned to approach each one without revealing what he was thinking until he had enough information to form a conclusion. What is the issue, Brenda? This young lady says she was with the SEAL teams. Brenda's voice carried a note of practiced patience, the tone of someone presenting a problem they have already solved in their head. But that does not sound right to me. Glenn took the ID card from the counter and examined it with the same skeptical attention Brenda had given it. When he looked at Mara, his face carried the patient expression of someone about to explain a simple misunderstanding to someone who did not know any better. The expression of a teacher correcting a student. The expression of authority addressing confusion. Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion here. The Navy SEALs are an all-male unit. Women serve in important support roles throughout the Navy, absolutely, but not in direct combat positions with Special Operations Forces. Perhaps you were assigned to a base that supported SEAL operations, and there has been a misunderstanding about your actual role. He said it gently, almost kindly. The way you might explain to someone that the lottery ticket they thought was a winner was actually printed with last week's numbers. Not trying to be cruel, just trying to help them understand reality before they embarrassed themselves further. Mara had anticipated this conversation too, had prepared for it the way she prepared for every mission. Intelligence gathering, threat assessment, contingency planning. She knew what the common objections would be, and she knew what evidence she carried to counter them. But preparation did not make the frustration any less sharp, did not quiet the anger that burned in her chest like an ember that refused to go out, no matter how many times she tried to smother it with patience and professionalism. Sir, I understand the confusion, but female corpsmen have been attached to SEAL teams since 2010. We are not SEALs ourselves. We do not wear the trident, but we deploy with them as their medical personnel. We go where they go. We train in the same pipeline. We carry the same weight across the same terrain. And when they get shot, we are the ones who keep them alive. A chair scraped against the floor in the second row. A man stood up. He was big, probably 6'2", with the thick shoulders and weathered hands of someone who had spent decades doing hard physical work in places where the work could kill you. His Marine Corps cap sat at a precise angle on his close-cropped gray hair, positioned with the unconscious exactness of someone who had worn covers for so many years that putting one on straight was as automatic as breathing. Campaign ribbons from Desert Storm decorated his worn field jacket. His boots were old but polished. His posture was a weapon in itself, the kind of bearing that announced rank and experience without requiring a single word. But he had words, and he intended to use them. "Excuse me, miss." Walt Crenshaw's voice carried the authority of a senior non-commissioned officer, even in retirement. It was a voice accustomed to being heard across motor pools and flight decks, across rifle ranges and parade grounds. A voice that expected attention and received it. "I am not trying to be difficult, but I did 3 tours overseas. Desert Storm, Somalia, and Kosovo. I never saw any women with special operations units. You might be thinking of a different kind of assignment. Administrative support can sometimes feel like combat duty when you are on a forward operating base, but it is not the same thing." He said it the way a man says something he believes completely. Not with malice, not with cruelty, but with the iron certainty of someone who has constructed his understanding of the world from personal experience and sees no reason to rebuild it based on the claims of a stranger who looks nothing like the warriors he has known. Walt Crenshaw was 68 years old. He had spent his entire adult life around military professionals. He had served with men who earned their decorations in blood and fire, and he had seen men who claimed decorations they never earned. He could spot a fake from across a room the way a jeweler spots a counterfeit diamond. Something in the weight, something in the light, something in the way it sits that tells the trained eye this is not real. And something about this young woman's story did not add up. Other veterans were watching now. Mara could see them exchanging glances, raising eyebrows, leaning forward to hear better. The silent communication of men who shared a common language of service and sacrifice, and who were now applying that shared understanding to evaluate the claims of an outsider. Whispers rippled through the waiting room like wind across water. "She looks too young. My nephew is a SEAL. He never mentioned women on the teams. Stolen valor. Probably happens all the time in these offices." The doubt in the room was becoming physical. A living thing with weight and texture pressing down on Mara's shoulders, compressing her lungs, making it harder to breathe. She had felt this pressure before. In the seconds before a firefight, when the air itself seemed to thicken with the knowledge that violence was about to erupt. But in those moments, she had a job to do, a role to play, a purpose that overrode everything else. Here she had nothing but words and documents and the truth, and none of them seemed to be enough. She opened her manila folder with hands that wanted to shake, but she would not let them. Not here. Not in front of these men who thought she was a fraud. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She had held a man's severed artery closed for 38 minutes while rounds impacted 2 meters from her position. She could hold her hand steady long enough to spread documents across a government counter. She laid them out with precise, controlled movements. Each page carefully organized corners aligned every detail in order. The habits of military documentation ingrained so deeply they had become reflex. "Here is my DD-214 discharge paperwork showing my military occupational specialty as 8404, which is Fleet Marine Force Corpsman. This is the designation for medical personnel trained and qualified to serve with Marine units and Naval Special Warfare teams." Her finger moved to the next document. "Here is my Combat Action Ribbon citation, awarded for providing medical care under direct enemy fire during Operation Enduring Freedom in Helmand Province, Afghanistan." And the next. "And here is the documentation for my Navy Achievement Medal, awarded for saving the lives of 3 wounded SEAL operators during a firefight on March 15, 2013. The citation describes 38 minutes of continuous medical intervention under sustained hostile fire, resulting in 3 critical casualties surviving to reach surgical facilities. Glenn Nolan examined the documents. He picked them up one at a time, read them slowly, held them at different angles as if checking for watermarks or signs of forgery. His expression remained doubtful throughout. The expression of a man who has been trained to verify and who finds verification inconvenient when the evidence contradicts his assumptions. He set down the combat action ribbon citation with a small shake of his head. These could belong to anyone. How do we know these are really yours? And even if they are, it does not prove you were actually with the SEAL team. You could have been stationed at the same base doing administrative work and received these awards for support functions. Walt Crenshaw had moved closer to the counter. His heavy boots were loud on the worn linoleum, each step carrying the deliberate weight of a man accustomed to making his presence known. Up close, Mara could see the map of his life written in the lines of his face. Sun damage from deployments to desert regions that left the skin permanently darkened increased. The slight stiffness in his left shoulder that spoke of an old injury, probably shrapnel, or a fall something that had healed wrong and now predicted rain better than any meteorologist. The direct challenging gaze of a man who had seen combat and did not appreciate civilians who claimed glory they had not earned. I do not mean any disrespect, miss. His voice was firm but not unkind. There was even something protective in it, the protectiveness of a man who believed he was guarding something sacred from contamination. Those boys do not just let anyone tag along on their missions. And no offense intended, but you do not exactly look like someone who could keep up with that kind of operation. He gestured vaguely at her frame. 5'4", 130 pounds. The unspoken comparison hanging in the air between them. The SEALs he had seen were built like armored vehicles. This woman was built like a schoolteacher. Mara felt the walls closing in. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself more aggressively, to raise her voice, to slam her palm on the counter, and demand the respect she had bled for. But she also knew that losing her temper would only reinforce their prejudices, would confirm their belief that she was emotional unstable, not professional, would give them permission to dismiss her completely. She had faced Taliban fighters who wanted her dead. She had treated catastrophic wounds while rounds impacted meters from her position, close enough that she could feel the shockwave of each impact through the ground beneath her knees. She had carried wounded teammates across hostile terrain with her own blood mixing with theirs. Her herniated discs screaming with every step, her vision narrowing from pain and exhaustion. But her hands never stopping, never slowing, never letting go. Yet here in a government office surrounded by fellow veterans, she felt more challenged than she ever had in combat. Because in combat, the enemy was clear. You knew who was trying to kill you, and you knew your team had your back. Here, the people questioning her were the same people she had served to protect. And the weapons being used against her were not bullets, but doubt, not explosives, but assumptions, not ambushes, but the quiet corrosive disbelief of people who looked at her and could not see past the surface. The room had grown quieter still. More people tuning into the confrontation at the reception desk. Mara could see the mixture of emotions on the faces around her. Skepticism dominated, settling over the room like fog. But there was also curiosity. And in a few faces particularly, the older veterans who had seen enough of the world to know it was more complicated than simple categories allowed, what looked almost like protective concern. Some of these men genuinely believed they were protecting the integrity of military service by questioning her claims. They were not villains. They were guardians of a tradition they held sacred. And Mara respected that, even as it was being used to erase her. Glenn Nolan's voice took on a tone of administrative finality, the voice of a bureaucrat preparing to close a file. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide some additional verification before we can process your claim. Maybe you could bring in someone who served with you, or get a letter from your commanding officer. Without that kind of corroboration, I am not comfortable moving forward with the documentation you have presented. Settle down, Marines. The voice came from the corner of the waiting room near the window, where morning sunlight cut through the Venetian blinds in sharp bars of gold that lay across the floor like the rungs of a ladder. The voice was gravelly, roughened by decades of tobacco and salt air scraped raw by whatever was eating away at the body that produced it. But it carried an authority that made every other voice in the room fall silent. Not the authority of volume or aggression, the authority of absolute certainty. The authority of a man who had spent 40 years giving orders in situations where the wrong order meant people died, and who had learned to speak with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Let the girl speak. The man in the wheelchair by the window had not moved. His hands rested on the armrests of his chair with the stillness of someone conserving energy for the things that truly mattered. An oxygen tank sat beside him, its clear tube running to a nasal cannula, the soft hiss of compressed air providing a constant quiet accompaniment to his breathing. A worn navy jacket lay across his lap, and even from across the room, Mara could see that the jacket was covered in ribbons and patches from a career that had spanned 4 decades and half the world's conflicts. Master Chief Roy Hargrove, 72 years old, known throughout the fleet as Iron, a name earned not through self-promotion, but through the accumulated testimony of hundreds of sailors who had served under him and discovered that the man was exactly what the nickname implied. Unbending, unyielding, unbreakable. Until the cancer came, and even then the breaking was only physical. Mara had noticed him when she first entered the waiting room. The way you notice landmarks in unfamiliar territory. An old sailor clearly sick, diminished by whatever disease was consuming him from the inside, but still watching the world with eyes that missed nothing. She had cataloged him as a senior enlisted veteran, probably career Navy, probably decorated, and had filed him away as a neutral presence unlikely to affect her appointment one way or another. She had been wrong about that last part. Iron Hargrove wheeled himself forward slowly. The pneumatic tires of his wheelchair whispered against the linoleum as he moved through the waiting room. As he passed, other veterans shifted to give him space. Not because his wheelchair required it, because his presence demanded it. There was something in the way he carried himself, even seated, even diminished, even tethered to an oxygen tank, that communicated a lifetime of command authority so deeply ingrained it had become part of his molecular structure. Walt Crenshaw, who had been challenging Mara with the confidence of a senior NCO, accustomed to being the most experienced person in any room, now stood at something close to attention, a reflex he probably was not even aware of. The instinctive recognition of superior rank that military service programs into your nervous system and never fully removes. Master Chief. Walt's voice carried respect that bordered on reverence. Iron Hargrove did not acknowledge the greeting. His eyes had not left Mara's face since he began speaking. His wheelchair came to rest directly in front of the reception counter, positioning himself between Mara and the room full of skeptics with the deliberate placement of a man accustomed to occupying exactly the right tactical position. Up close, Mara could see that his face was gaunt. Skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, the flesh beneath hollowed out by disease. The cancer was eating him from the inside, and it was not being subtle about it. His hands resting on the wheelchair arms were thin, the veins standing out like blue rivers on a topographic map. But his eyes were sharp as broken glass. They examined her with the thoroughness he had once used to inspect sailors on deck, the kind of inspection where nothing escaped notice, where a scuffed boot or a loose button told a story about discipline and attention that no amount of verbal explanation could override. Young lady. His voice was quieter now that he was closer, but no less commanding. Each word required effort pushed out through lungs that were losing their capacity to function, but delivered with the precision of someone who understood that words like ammunition should not be wasted. What team were you with? The question was simple, 5 words. But the weight behind it was entirely different from anything else that had been said in that waiting room. This was not another skeptic trying to catch her in a lie. This was not a bureaucrat looking for reasons to delay her claim. This was a senior sailor asking a legitimate operational question. And the difference between that question and everything that had come before was the difference between an interrogation and a conversation between professionals. Mara felt something shift in the room. A change in atmospheric pressure that only she and the old Master Chief seemed to register. SEAL Team 3, Master Chief, Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class, 2 deployments. Helmand Province 2012 through 2013. Iron Hargrove's eyes narrowed, not with doubt, with the focused attention of someone accessing memories filed away in the deep archives of a long career. Memories that most people would never have reason to retrieve, but that remained indexed and organized and ready for recall because that was the kind of mind he possessed. March 2013. His voice dropped lower. Quiet enough that people in the back of the room leaned forward, unconsciously drawn by the gravity of whatever was happening between this dying old sailor and this young woman who claimed to be something the room did not want to believe. Village ambush outside Sangin. Operation Vigilant Sentinel. 3 critical casualties extracted under sustained fire. The room went absolutely silent. The kind of silence that has texture that you can feel against your skin. The silence of people who have suddenly realized they are witnessing something significant and do not want to miss a single word. Mara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a percussive rhythm that seemed loud enough for everyone to hear. How did he know? That operation had been classified when it happened. Some details had been declassified since then, filtered into after-action reports and administrative records that were accessible to people with appropriate clearance. But the specific date, the operation name, the number of casualties, those were details that required either direct involvement or access to files that most people in this room could not imagine existed. You. Mara's voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw by surprise and the first tremors of an emotion she could not yet identify. She cleared her throat and tried again. You know about that mission. Iron Hargrove's weathered face creased into something that was not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. Something that contained knowledge and pain and the weight of a decision made years ago that had never stopped pressing down on his conscience. I know more than that, Doc Kessler. The word Doc hit Mara like a physical force. It was the name her team had called her. Not her rank, not her last name, not hey you or the medic or the girl. Doc. The title of respect that SEAL operators reserved for the corpsmen who kept them alive. The title that said, you belong with us. You are one of us. We trust you with the most important thing we possess, which is each other. No one had called her Doc in 14 months. Hearing it from this dying stranger in a VA wheelchair made her throat close with an emotion that threatened to shatter the composure she had been maintaining through sheer willpower. I was Senior Enlisted Advisor to Naval Personnel Command when your Silver Star recommendation crossed my desk in 2013. He paused, and in that pause something flickered across his features. Pain, but not the physical kind. The cancer was hurting him certainly, every breath a negotiation with lungs that were losing the war. But this pain was different. This was the pain of memory, of conscience, of a man confronting a failure that had followed him for 8 years, like a shadow he could not outrun no matter how far or fast he traveled. I was on the review board that downgraded it to a Navy Achievement Medal. The silence in the room changed character. No longer the quiet of skepticism or curiosity. Now it was the stillness of people holding their breath, the stillness that precedes revelation. The stillness of a room full of veterans who understood the weight of what had just been said because they understood what a Silver Star meant and what it meant to have one taken away. Mara stared at the old Master Chief, unable to process what she had just heard. This man, this dying sailor in the wheelchair connected to an oxygen tank in the corner of a VA waiting room. He had been part of the decision that had haunted her for 8 years. He was part of the reason that the most significant action of her military career, the 38 minutes that defined everything she was and everything she had sacrificed, had been reduced to a citation that made it sound routine, made it sound like something any competent medic might have done on an average Tuesday. Anger flared hot in her chest. A burst of heat that started behind her sternum and radiated outward through her shoulders, down her arms into the hands that had held a dying man's artery, closed while the world exploded around her. 8 years of anger compressed and contained and buried under layers of professionalism and acceptance, suddenly igniting at the proximity of the man who had helped put it there. But before she could speak, before she could give voice to the fire building inside her, Walt Crenshaw cut in. With all respect, Master Chief, anyone with access to classified files could know mission details. That still does not prove this young lady was actually there. He looked at Mara, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression now. A softening around the edges of his skepticism that suggested he was beginning to doubt his own certainty, but was not yet ready to abandon it completely. I want to believe you, miss. I really do. But we have all met people who make false claims about military service, without proof beyond paperwork that could belong to anyone. She has proof. Iron Hargrove interrupted with the quiet force of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never needed to. His eyes had not left Mara's face. The kind of proof that cannot be faked, cannot be bought, cannot be stolen from someone else's service record or downloaded from the internet or fabricated in a print shop. He turned his wheelchair slightly to address the room. Every person in the waiting area was watching now. The Navy veteran in the USS Enterprise cap, the 2 younger veterans who had been comparing claim numbers, the man in the corner who had been sitting with his eyes closed and was now very much alert, Glenn Nolan behind the counter, Brenda with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, Walt Crenshaw standing at near attention, all of them caught in the gravity of whatever was unfolding between this old Master Chief and this young woman. Doc Kessler has documentation that was written on her body by the men she served with, a permanent record created in the field by her own team, a record that tells a story no forger could replicate because it was made with the tools and materials available at a forward operating base in a combat zone, and it carries the marks of that origin in every line. Glenn Nolan leaned forward over the counter. His professional neutrality had been replaced by genuine curiosity. What are you talking about? What kind of documentation? Iron Hargrove looked back at Mara. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been. Not softer, gentler. The difference between reducing volume and reducing force. His words still carried weight, but the weight was wrapped in something that felt like understanding. That is not my story to tell, Doc. The question is whether you are willing to show them. I know what I read in the after-action reports. I know what Chief Voss wrote about your team marking you as family, but these people need to see it for themselves. Mara's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder. Her fingers pressed against the fabric of her gray sweater, and underneath she could feel the raised texture of ink and scar tissue. The tattoo that covered most of her upper back was something she kept hidden from the civilian world. Not because she was ashamed of it, because it was sacred, because it was private, because it represented a bond between her and 7 men who had seen her at her absolute worst, at her most broken and bloody and terrified, and had chosen to mark her as one of their own. That marking was not something she shared with strangers. It was not a conversation piece for dinner parties or a story for social media. It was a covenant written in permanent ink on living skin, and it belonged to her and her team and no one else. That would require removing my sweater, Master Chief. Her voice was quiet but steady. I am not sure that is appropriate in this setting. I will go with you as a female witness. The voice came from the middle of the waiting room. Mara turned to see an older woman standing, late 40s, wearing an Army field jacket with Desert Storm patches and the insignia of the Army Nurse Corps. Her face was kind but lined with the same weathered quality that marked so many veterans in the room. The face of someone who had seen things that most people only encountered in nightmares and had learned to carry that knowledge in the architecture of her expression. Nora Daly. Army nurse, Gulf War. If you are going to show something that requires privacy, you should have another woman present. Someone who understands. Mara studied the woman's face. Nora Daly. The name did not register as significant. Not yet. That connection was still hidden, waiting in the near future like an unexploded ordnance buried just below the surface of a road that appeared safe to walk. Glenn Nolan looked uncertain, glancing between Mara and Iron Hargrove and the crowd of veterans who were now completely invested in the outcome of this confrontation. The bureaucrat in him wanted to follow procedure. The human in him wanted to see what happened next. After a moment's hesitation, the human won. We can use conference room B, down the hall, second door on the left. He looked at Walt Crenshaw. Sir, if you would like to witness as well, I think that would be appropriate, given your concerns. Walt nodded slowly. His earlier certainty had developed cracks. Not enough to crumble, but enough to let light through. I would appreciate that. If I am wrong about this, I want to be man enough to admit it. Iron Hargrove was already wheeling himself toward the hallway. Then let us settle this the right way, with truth and respect. A young woman in the back of the waiting room stood up. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing an Air Force sweatshirt that had been washed so many times the logo was barely visible. Her face was pale but determined, and Mara recognized something in her eyes. The look of someone who has been fighting a similar battle and has been watching this confrontation with more than casual interest. Can I come too? I am Shelby Parrish. I served in Iraq with security forces. I faced similar questions when I filed my claim last year. Glenn glanced at the growing group. Fine, but let us keep this small. Master Chief Hargrove, Mr. Crenshaw, Miss Daly, and Miss Parrish. That is it. They moved down the hallway in a strange procession. Iron Hargrove's wheelchair led the way, its motor humming softly as he navigated the narrow corridor with the efficiency of someone accustomed to operating in tight spaces. Mara walked beside him, her folder tucked under her arm, her heart rate elevated but controlled. Behind them came Glenn, Walt, Nora, and Shelby, their footsteps echoing off the institutional walls in a rhythm that sounded almost ceremonial. Conference Room B was small and windowless. A rectangular table surrounded by 6 chairs. A whiteboard on one wall that still showed the faint remnants of someone's notes about benefits processing. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, flat illumination that washed out colors and eliminated shadows. A room designed for function, not comfort. A room where decisions were made and lives were processed, and human beings were reduced to claim numbers and disability percentages. Iron Hargrove wheeled himself to one end of the table. The others arranged themselves around the room, giving Mara space, but watching with an intensity that made the small room feel even smaller. Walt Crenshaw stood near the door, arms crossed over his chest, his expression still skeptical, but no longer hostile. The difference was subtle, but real. Nora Daly positioned herself near Mara, with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to providing support in high-stress situations. Shelby Parrish stayed near the back wall, her eyes wide and intent, watching everything. Glenn Nolan pulled out a notepad because the bureaucrat never fully surrendered to the human. Mara stood at the head of the table. Her hands moved to the hem of her gray sweater and paused there. She looked at each person in the room, taking their measure, deciding how much of herself she was willing to expose in this fluorescent box surrounded by strangers. What you are about to see was created at Forward Operating Base Leatherneck in Afghanistan. 1 week after the mission, Master Chief Hargrove mentioned, "My team insisted on doing it themselves. They said it had to come from the team. From the family, not from an outsider, not from a civilian tattoo artist back in the States. It had to be made in the place where it was earned by the men who were there." She lifted the sweater up and over her head and turned around slowly, presenting her back to the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of doubt, not the silence of skepticism. The silence of people confronted with something so raw, so powerful, so unmistakably authentic, that every assumption they had carried into this room was being dismantled in real time. The tattoo covered most of Mara's upper back from her shoulder blades down to just above her waistline. It was not the polished professional work you would find in an expensive American tattoo parlor with its clean lines and perfect shading and Instagram-ready precision. The line work was rougher, more organic, done with improvised equipment under difficult conditions by hands that were steadier with rifles and scalpels than with tattoo needles. But that roughness only added to its authenticity, its raw power. This was not decoration. This was documentation. The centerpiece was a detailed medical cross rendered in stark black ink, but it was surrounded by elements that transformed it from a simple symbol into a complex narrative. 3 sets of dog tags were wrapped around the cross, each one carefully detailed with names and service numbers in precise military font. Briggs C. Daly L. Greaves W. Along Mara's right shoulder blade, a string of numbers. 32 degrees, 86 minutes, 43 seconds north. 64 degrees, 36 minutes, 71 seconds east. GPS coordinates tattooed with military precision, marking a specific point on the surface of the earth where something terrible and extraordinary had happened. Below the cross, a pair of combat boots sat empty, their laces tied together in the traditional memorial style that every service member recognized. The symbol for the fallen. The symbol for those who had walked into a fight and been carried out. And woven throughout the design in 7 different styles of handwriting were signatures. Actual autographs traced over in permanent ink, each one distinct and personal. The hand of a man who wrote in tight, controlled letters. The hand of a man whose signature was a bold slash across the skin. The hand of a man who dotted his I's and crossed his T's even when signing his name on a teammate's back in a combat zone. But what made Walt Crenshaw lean forward with his mouth slightly open? What made Nora Daly gasp and press her hand against her chest? What made Iron Hargrove's eyes shine with something that might have been tears if he were the kind of man who admitted to tears? What stopped every person in that room from breathing for a span of seconds that felt much longer than it was? The scars. Shrapnel scars and surgical scars that had been incorporated into the tattoo design. Not hidden, not covered. Integrated. The raised tissue forming part of the artwork itself, the ridges and valleys of healed wounds becoming topographic features in a map of survival. Whoever had designed this tattoo had used Mara's injuries as elements of the composition building around them and through them, making the scars part of the story instead of something to be concealed. This was not just a tattoo. It was a map of trauma and survival written on living skin. Iron Hargrove was the first to break the silence. His voice came out rougher than usual, thick with an emotion he did not bother to conceal. They gave you blood wings. 3 words that only people with deep military knowledge would fully understand. Blood wings. The tradition of pinning an insignia into a service member's chest with enough force to draw blood. A mark of acceptance, a mark of belonging, painful and permanent and absolutely real. Walt Crenshaw had moved closer without realizing it. His skepticism had not just cracked, it had shattered. Fallen away from him like armor he no longer needed because the threat he had been defending against did not exist. Those coordinates. His voice was barely above a whisper. You can verify those on military databases. That is an actual grid reference. An actual location. You cannot fake GPS coordinates and have them match a classified operations site. That is not possible. Nora Daly was staring at one particular set of dog tags. Her hand had moved from her chest to cover her mouth, and her eyes were filling with tears that she made no effort to stop. She was reading the name on the center tag, reading it again and again, as if repetition might change what it said. Daly. Her voice was barely audible. Logan Daly. She looked up at Mara with an expression that combined shock and grief and desperate hope in equal measure. That is my younger brother. Logan is my younger brother. He is a SEAL. He got wounded in Afghanistan in 2013. He never told us any details. He just said he got hurt and recovered. Would not talk about it no matter how many times we asked. Would not explain why he woke up screaming at night for months afterward. Would not tell our parents why he left the teams and went into private security work instead of re-enlisting. The connection that had been waiting just below the surface like unexploded ordnance had finally detonated, and the blast radius was larger than anyone in the room had anticipated. Mara pulled her sweater back down and turned around. When she looked at Nora Daly, her voice carried the particular gentleness that medical professionals develop when delivering information that will change someone's understanding of the world. Your brother took a 7.62 millimeter rifle round through his subclavian artery during the ambush on March 15th. Without immediate intervention, he would have bled out in less than 4 minutes. I maintained direct pressure on that wound for 38 minutes while we were still under enemy fire. He is alive because the arterial bleed was controlled until we could get him to a surgical facility at Leatherneck. Nora's face crumpled. The composed, competent Army nurse who had volunteered as a witness dissolved into a sister who had just learned that someone in this room had held her brother's life in her hands and refused to let go. He just said he got dinged up. Whenever we asked for details, he would change the subject or make a joke about it. Our whole family has been in the dark for 8 years. 8 years of knowing something terrible happened and not knowing what. Not knowing who saved him. Walt Crenshaw was not looking at the tattoo anymore. He was looking at Mara's face, and his expression had undergone a transformation so complete that it was like watching a different man inhabit the same body. The skeptic was gone. The challenger was gone. In their place stood a veteran who had just been confronted with the kind of truth that does not allow you to remain who you were 5 minutes ago. Those coordinates. His voice had changed. No longer the commanding bark of a senior NCO. Now it was the quiet, almost reverent tone of a man delivering testimony. I was stationed at Camp Leatherneck when a medevac helicopter came in with 3 critical SEAL casualties. March of 2013. The corpsman who came off that bird was still covered in blood. Still had her hands on one casualty's wound. She refused medical treatment for herself until all 3 men were in surgery. He stopped, his weathered face working through the memory, pulling it from the deep storage where he had filed it years ago without understanding its full significance. That was you. I helped unload that helicopter. I was on the flight line when it came in, and I saw you jump down from the bird still maintaining pressure on that operator's artery. Your hands were shaking from sustained compression, but you would not let go. The flight medic tried to take over, and you told him you had been holding that wound for 38 minutes, and you were not going to let go in the last 100 yards. He paused. I have told that story a dozen times over the years, about the female corpsman who came off the medevac bird still holding a SEAL's artery closed. I just never knew her name. I never knew it was you. The room was absolutely still. 5 people processing 5 different versions of the same revelation. Nora Daly learning the truth about her brother. Walt Crenshaw discovering that the woman he had challenged was the anonymous hero of a story he had been telling for 8 years. Shelby Parrish watching with tears streaming down her face, seeing in Mara's story a reflection of her own dismissed service. Glenn Nolan sitting with his pen motionless above his notepad. The bureaucrat finally and completely surrendered to the human, and Iron Hargrove watching all of it from his wheelchair, with eyes that carried the weight of what he had done and what he had come here to set right. Now everyone in this room knows what Doc Kessler did on March 15th. Iron Hargrove's voice cut through the emotional silence with the precision of a man who understood that there was more truth to deliver, and that delivering it would be the hardest thing he had done since the diagnosis. But there is something else you need to know. Something about what happened after. He reached into a bag hanging on the back of his wheelchair and pulled out a folder. It was thick, worn at the edges from repeated handling, the kind of folder that gets that way from being opened and read and closed and reopened dozens of times by hands that cannot stop returning to its contents. Chief Decker Voss, who was Doc Kessler's team leader, wrote the most powerful Silver Star recommendation I have read in 40 years of service. 8 SEAL operators gave witness statements describing her actions as the most courageous medical intervention under fire they had ever witnessed. The surgical team at Leatherneck wrote that all 3 casualties survived specifically because of the extraordinary pre-hospital care provided under combat conditions. His jaw tightened. Mara could see how much it cost him to continue. Each word extracted from his conscience like a splinter pulled from deep tissue. And I was part of the review board that downgraded that Silver Star to a Navy Achievement Medal. Not because her actions did not merit the higher award. They did. Every member of that board knew they did. But because one senior officer argued that awarding a Silver Star to a female corpsman in 2013 would create political complications, would set a precedent that might generate controversy, would draw attention to the presence of women in combat roles at a time when that conversation was politically sensitive. He paused. The hiss of his oxygen tank filled the silence. The officer who made that argument was Captain Warren Aldridge, and I did not fight hard enough against his reasoning. I voted with the majority because it was easier than standing alone. We put politics ahead of honor. We chose bureaucratic convenience over recognizing genuine heroism. And I have carried that failure every single day for 8 years. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the conference room table with the same careful precision Mara had used to display her documents at the reception counter. But that is not all. After I retired from active duty, I started investigating other award reviews from that same period. Captain Aldridge reviewed combat award recommendations for 7 female service members between 2011 and 2014. All of them described extraordinary actions under fire. Every single one was downgraded to a lesser award. Doc Kessler's case was not isolated. It was systematic. The folder contained photocopies of official documents, handwritten notes, cross-referenced timelines, and a list of 7 names. 7 women. 7 acts of courage. 7 awards diminished by the same man for the same reason. Nora Daly spoke first. Her voice was tight with controlled anger, the anger of a woman who understood institutional injustice because she had encountered it in her own military career, and who was now seeing it applied to the person who had saved her brother's life. So my brother almost died, was saved by this woman's courage. And then the military bureaucracy decided her heroism did not deserve full recognition because she was female. That is not just wrong. That is a disgrace to everyone who has ever worn the uniform. Iron Hargrove looked at Mara. In his eyes, she could see the disease that was killing him, the guilt that had driven him to this moment, and the fierce burning determination to use whatever time he had left to correct a wrong that should never have existed. I tracked you down through the VA system, Doc. I came here today specifically to find you, because I have all the original documentation, the witness statements, the after-action reports, Chief Voss's Silver Star recommendation, evidence of Aldridge's pattern across multiple cases. Everything. He pushed the folder across the table toward her. The decision about what to do with it is yours, not mine. I have already made my mistake. I will not make another one by deciding for someone else what they should do with their own truth. Mara looked at the folder, looked at the 7 names, looked at the old Master Chief who was dying in a wheelchair, but fighting harder than anyone she had met since leaving Afghanistan, looked at Nora Daly, who had come to this room as a witness and discovered the identity of the woman who saved her brother, looked at Walt Crenshaw, the skeptic who had become an ally, looked at Shelby Parrish, the young veteran who had found hope in watching someone else refuse to be erased. She picked up the folder and felt its weight in her hands. Not just paper and ink. 8 years of questions. 8 years of doubt. 8 years of wondering if the men who had marked her back had been right to trust her, or if the review board had been right to diminish her. She did not have answers yet, did not know what she would do with this information, or how far she was willing to take it, or what it would cost her to fight a system that had already proven it could reduce extraordinary courage to ordinary paperwork. But she had the truth. And for the first time in 8 years, she had people willing to stand beside her while she figured out what to do with it. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the VA office, Mara Elise Kessler sat on the floor of her apartment with her back against the couch and her laptop balanced on her knees, and 217 unread emails glowing on the screen like small fires she could not put out. Her phone lay face down on the carpet beside her, silenced after the fourth reporter called before 9 in the morning. She had stopped answering unknown numbers on the second day. By the fifth day, she had stopped answering numbers she recognized too, because everyone she knew wanted to talk about the same thing, and talking about it made her hands shake and her back seize and the nightmares worse. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living space barely large enough for a couch and a coffee table. She had chosen it 14 months ago, when she separated from the Navy, chosen it specifically because it was unremarkable. A quiet neighborhood near the coast, where no one looked twice at the young woman who came and went at irregular hours, who kept to herself, who seemed to have no distinguishing features worth remembering. The kind of place where anonymity was not just possible, but guaranteed by the fundamental indifference of neighbors who had their own lives to manage and no interest in managing anyone else's. That anonymity was gone now. Destroyed in 72 hours by a man named Michael Pruitt, who ran a military blog with 40,000 followers and who had been sitting in the VA waiting room that morning. Mara had not noticed him, had been too focused on the confrontation at the counter and then the revelation in conference room B to catalog every face in the room. But Pruitt had noticed everything, had taken notes on his phone while pretending to scroll through social media, had reconstructed the entire scene from memory that evening, and posted it under a headline that was designed to travel fast and far. And did. Female SEAL medic denied Silver Star. A pattern of bias exposed. Within 12 hours, the post had been shared 800,000 times across social media platforms. Within 24 hours, Military Times had picked it up with their own reporters adding context and background. Within 48 hours, Fox News ran a segment featuring a retired general who called the story troubling, and a commentator who called it a hoax, and a panel of experts who argued with each other about whether women belonged in combat, while Mara's name scrolled across the bottom of the screen in a ticker that reduced her entire life to a single line of text. CNN followed. Then the Washington Post. Then outlets she had never heard of, military podcasts and veteran advocacy channels, and political commentators who used her story as ammunition for whatever argument they were already having. She became a symbol before she had agreed to symbolize anything, became a cause before she had decided whether she wanted to fight. The emails ran the full spectrum of human response. Some came from female veterans sharing their own stories of service questioned, and awards diminished, and contributions erased by a system that processed them as anomalies rather than participants. These emails were detailed and raw, written in the early morning hours by women who could not sleep. Women who had carried the weight of diminished recognition for years, and who had seen Mara's story and felt something crack open inside them that they had been holding shut for a very long time. Other emails came from men who were convinced that women had no place in combat, that Mara's entire story was fabricated for attention or political gain, that she was part of a conspiracy to weaken the military by inserting women into roles they were biologically and psychologically unfit to perform. These emails were also detailed, also raw, also written in the early morning hours by people who could not sleep. The anger in them was genuine even when the reasoning was not. They called her a liar, a fraud, an attention seeker, a disgrace to the uniform she claimed to have worn. Some of them included threats specific enough that she had forwarded them to a friend who worked in law enforcement and then tried not to think about them. And then there were the emails that fell in between. The ones that said, "I want to believe you, but I need more proof." The ones that said, "My son is a SEAL, and he never mentioned women serving with his team." The ones that said, "This feels politically motivated." The ones that expressed doubt, wrapped in courtesy, suspicion cushioned by qualifications, disbelief presented as reasonable caution. These were in some ways the hardest to read because they came from people who were not hostile, but who could not bridge the gap between what they had always believed and what Mara's story asked them to accept. She closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her thighs. The trembling had started again. Not the gross motor shaking of cold or fear, but the fine vibration that lived in her tendons and muscles and emerged when her nervous system decided that the current level of stress warranted a physical response. Her body remembering danger even when her mind knew she was safe. Her hands performing the autonomic inventory of threat that had kept her alive in Helmand Province and now made civilian life an exercise in constant false alarms. The nightmares had changed. For the first 14 months after her discharge, they had followed a consistent pattern. She was back in Afghanistan, back in the dust and noise and chaos of a firefight, treating casualties whose wounds she could not close, calling for medevac on a radio that produced only static running toward the sound of gunfire, because that was where the wounded would be, and her job was to be where the wounded were. Those nightmares were terrible, but familiar. She understood them. They were her brain processing trauma through the only language it knew, replaying the worst moments in an endless loop, searching for a resolution that would never come, because you cannot change what already happened, no matter how many times your subconscious forces you to relive it. The new nightmares were different. In the new dreams, she stood on a stage in front of an audience that stretched to the horizon. Thousands of faces watching her. Millions. She was trying to show them her tattoo, trying to turn around and present the evidence on her back. But every time she turned, the audience turned with her so that she was always facing them and they could never see the proof. She produced documents that dissolved in her hands like wet paper. She spoke, but her words came out in a language no one understood. She reached for her team, but they were gone, replaced by empty chairs arranged in precise military rows that extended into infinite distance. She woke from these dreams with her heart hammering and her sheets soaked and the chronic pain in her lower back flaring hot and bright. 3 herniated discs from the IED blast during her second deployment. The doctors at Walter Reed had told her she was lucky to be walking. Most days it did not feel lucky. Most days it felt like her spine was a loaded weapon pointed at her own nervous system, and every wrong movement pulled the trigger. The ibuprofen was on the kitchen counter. She took 3, knowing the recommended dose was 2, knowing her gastroenterologist would disapprove, knowing that the alternative was spending the day unable to stand upright. She chased them with cold coffee that had been sitting on the counter since yesterday and tasted like it. Her phone buzzed against the carpet. She almost ignored it. Had been ignoring everything for 2 days, retreating into the survival strategy she had developed during the worst periods of her deployments. When the situation is overwhelming, reduce your world to what is directly in front of you. 1 task, 1 minute, 1 breath. Do not think about the larger picture because the larger picture will crush you. But the name on the screen was not a reporter or a stranger or a well-meaning friend who wanted to process her trauma through conversation. The name on the screen was Master Chief Roy Hargrove. She picked up the phone. Doc Kessler. His voice was rougher than it had been 3 weeks ago. Each word carried more friction, more resistance, as if the air in his lungs had to fight harder to become sound. The cancer was progressing, moving through his body with the same relentless efficiency that had once characterized the man himself. Iron Hargrove was being consumed by a disease that shared his most defining quality, the refusal to stop advancing until the mission was complete. I know you are overwhelmed. I have been following the news coverage. Most of it gets the basic facts right and the important details wrong, which is how journalism has always worked when it comes to military stories. But there is someone who wants to talk to you. Actually, several someones. He paused. She could hear the hiss of his oxygen tank in the background, the mechanical breathing of the machine that was keeping him alive, 1 measured inhalation at a time. Your old team doc. They saw the story. Mara felt her throat constrict. A physical narrowing that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with emotion she was not prepared to feel. Her team, the 7 men whose signatures were tattooed on her back. The men she had not spoken to in over a year because the transition to civilian life had required her to build distance between who she was now and who she had been in Afghanistan, and those men were the strongest bridge back to a person she was trying to set down without abandoning entirely. Colton Briggs called me 2 days ago. His voice was tight when he talked about the news coverage. Said things I will not repeat in polite company about the people questioning your service. He tracked down Logan Daly and Weston Greaves. Chief Voss got in touch yesterday after his wife showed him the Military Times article. They want to do a video call with you, all 4 of them together. Iron Hargrove paused again. His breathing was audible now, the labored rhythm of lungs that were losing territory daily. They are ready to go public with what really happened that day and on the other operations. They want to give testimony, do interviews, whatever it takes. But they will not do it without your permission. Those men respect your right to decide how your own story gets told, and they will follow your lead. Mara walked to the window of her apartment and looked out at the street below. Normal people moving through a normal Tuesday. A woman walking a golden retriever. A man loading groceries into the trunk of his car. Two teenage girls on bicycles laughing about something that only teenage girls would find funny. The ordinary machinery of civilian life, operating with the smooth indifference of a world that did not know or care that a woman in a second-floor apartment was trying to decide how much of herself she was willing to expose to public consumption. When? Tonight, if you are willing. 8 o'clock your time. I will send you the video conference link. He stopped, and she could hear him choosing his next words with the care of a man who understood that language, like everything else in his diminishing life, was a resource to be spent wisely. Doc, I know this has been hard. The attention and the scrutiny and the people who have decided you are a liar without knowing the first thing about what you did. But your team wants you to know you are not alone in this. Whatever you decide to do next, they have got your back. Same as always. After they hung up, Mara sat on her couch and stared at nothing for a long time. The folder Iron Hargrove had given her 3 weeks ago sat on her coffee table, worn now from repeated reading. She had opened it every night since the VA office, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 3 in the morning when the nightmares woke her and sleep was not coming back. She had memorized every document inside. Chief Decker Voss's Silver Star recommendation, written in the precise, understated language of military documentation that somehow still conveyed the chaos and terror of March 15, 2013. 8 witness statements from SEAL operators who described her actions in language that ranged from clinical to emotional, but converged on a single point: she had saved 3 lives through extraordinary courage and medical skill under conditions that would have broken most people. After-action reports that documented the timeline with brutal specificity. Enemy contact initiated at 0947. First casualty sustained at 0949. Second and third casualties at 0952. Corpsman Kessler initiated treatment of all 3 casualties simultaneously while under sustained direct fire. Medevac extraction at 10:25. Total elapsed time of continuous medical intervention under combat conditions 38 minutes. And the evidence of Captain Warren Aldridge's pattern. 7 women. 7 acts of courage, 7 awards diminished. The documentation was damning in its consistency. Each case followed the same trajectory. Commanding officer submits recommendation for a high-level combat award. Witness statements support the recommendation unanimously. After-action reports confirm the facts. The review board receives the package. Aldridge argues that the political implications of the award outweigh the merits of the action. The board votes to downgrade. The woman receives a lesser medal and a citation that makes her heroism sound like competent performance of routine duties. 7 times in 4 years. 7 women who had bled and fought and saved lives and been told that what they did was not quite enough to merit the recognition their male counterparts would have received automatically. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Nora Daly. Logan finally agreed to talk about what happened that day. He wants to meet you. Says it is time our family understood what you did for him. He has been carrying this alone for 8 years, and he is ready to put it down. Mara set the phone on the couch cushion beside her and pressed her palms against her temples. The headache that lived behind her eyes was intensifying the chronic companion that the VA neurologist attributed to a combination of blast exposure and sustained hypervigilance, and the cumulative toll of 2 years in a combat zone where the human brain was never permitted to fully relax. By 7:45 that evening, she had her laptop set up on the kitchen table. A glass of water sat within reach. The folder from Iron Hargrove was organized beside the computer with specific documents flagged for reference. She had changed into a clean shirt and pulled her hair back, and spent 10 minutes looking at herself in the bathroom mirror, trying to see what other people saw when they looked at her, trying to find some external evidence of what she carried internally. Some mark visible to the naked eye that would save her the trouble of constantly proving what should have been obvious. There was nothing. Same face. Same unremarkable features. Same brown hair. The proof was hidden as it had always been beneath fabric and skin. The video call connected at exactly 8 o'clock. Military time was the one habit none of them had been able to break. When you have spent years in an environment where a 30-second delay could mean the difference between a successful extraction and a body bag punctuality stops being a courtesy and becomes a reflex. 4 faces appeared on her screen, and the emotion hit Mara like a blast wave. The sudden pressure of feeling too much too fast, the kind of sensory overload that her therapist called an emotional flashback, and that Mara called Tuesday because it happened often enough to have lost its novelty but never its power. Colton Briggs appeared first. 32 now, with the lean build of someone who stayed fit through discipline rather than necessity. His hair was longer than any SEAL commander would have tolerated falling past his ears in a way that announced civilian life more loudly than any words could. He wore a paramedic uniform from the Seattle Fire Department, and his easy smile was the same one Mara remembered from 100 missions, the smile of a man who used humor to deflect fear and was so good at it that most people never realized he was afraid. Doc Kessler. His voice carried genuine warmth, and behind it something rawer. Something that sounded like relief. It has been too long. Logan Daly appeared next. 34, broader through the shoulders than she remembered, with a full beard that would have earned him a week of extra duty during active service. He wore the casual confidence of a private security contractor, a man comfortable operating in ambiguous environments where the rules were flexible and the consequences were not. But his eyes softened when he looked at Mara with an expression she had seen only once before on the medevac helicopter 8 years ago, when he had regained consciousness long enough to look at her hands on his wound and understand what she was doing and what it meant. Doc, I heard you met my sister Nora. She finally knows the full story of what happened to me. Our whole family does now. He paused and something moved across his face. Thank you for that. I could never find the words to tell them myself. Weston Greaves appeared third. 33, thin, wearing wire-rimmed glasses that he absolutely did not need during their deployments because his vision had been perfect before the traumatic brain injury that ended his career. The TBI had taken many things from him. His ability to process visual information at combat speed. His tolerance for loud noises. His memory of most of March 15, 2013. But it had not taken his intelligence or his quiet, deliberate way of thinking through problems. He had rebuilt his life as a physical therapist, specializing in TBI rehabilitation, turning his own damage into expertise that helped others navigate the same terrain. Hey, Doc. Good to see your face again. And then, Chief Petty Officer Decker Voss. 48 years old, retired from the Navy, but still carrying himself with the command presence that had made him one of the most respected team leaders in the SEAL community. His hair was graying at the temples, and he had put on maybe 15 pounds of the weight that accumulates when you trade 18-hour operational days for the slower rhythms of civilian life. But his eyes were the same sharp assessment tools that had evaluated every tactical situation they had faced together. The same eyes that had looked at Mara on her first day with the team and decided before she had proven anything that she deserved a chance to prove everything. Doc Kessler, the team has been talking. We need to discuss what is happening and what we are going to do about it. Mara found her voice. It came out rougher than she wanted, scraped by 3 weeks of silence and emotion, and the particular exhaustion of being publicly dissected by millions of strangers. It is good to see all of you. I am sorry I have been out of touch. Colton waved that off with the casual dismissal of someone who understood exactly why she had pulled away and did not hold it against her. We understand transition. Every one of us struggled with it. But Doc, what is happening to you now? The story going viral. People questioning your service again. That is not something you should face alone. Chief Voss leaned forward, his face filling more of the screen. Doc Master Chief Hargrove sent me the documentation. Your original Silver Star recommendation, the witness statements, the pattern of bias in Aldridge's reviews. I want you to know that every word I wrote in that recommendation was true. You earned that Silver Star. You earned it in blood and courage and skill that saved 3 lives that day. And the fact that a bureaucrat decided your gender mattered more than your actions is a failure of the system, not a reflection of your service. Logan's voice was tight with emotion that he was managing the way operators managed everything by compartmentalizing it into a box small enough to carry while still functioning. Doc, there is something I never told you. When I was bleeding out that day, going into shock, my vision tunneling down to a pinpoint, I was sure I was dying. I kept thinking about Nora and my parents, about my nieces who had not been born yet, but who I somehow knew would exist, about all the things I would never get to do, and all the people I would never get to see again. He stopped, composed himself, continued. And then I heard your voice, calm and certain as if we were sitting in a mess hall instead of taking fire from 3 positions. Think about Nora Logan. Think about your family. You are not dying today. That voice is what kept me anchored. For 38 minutes, your voice was the only thing between me and the dark. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice had hardened into something that was no longer grief, but anger. You gave me 30 more years with my family. I got to meet my nieces. I was there when Nora got married. I have had a whole life because you would not let me die in a dirt road in Helmand Province. And then the Navy decided your actions did not merit full recognition because you are a woman. That is not just wrong. That is an insult to every person who has ever risked their life to save another. Weston spoke quietly. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone who chose words carefully because words were one of the things the TBI had made more difficult, and he refused to waste them. I do not remember most of March 15th. The TBI took that from me, but I remember your voice. Checking my pupils, talking to me even when I could not respond, telling me to stay awake when all I wanted was to close my eyes and let the dark take me. The doctors at Leatherneck told me later that your neuroassessments during transport probably saved me from permanent brain damage. You knew exactly what to watch for and how to manage it while simultaneously treating 2 other critical casualties under fire. That is not competence. That is something beyond what training alone can produce. Colton's expression had turned serious. The easy smile was gone, replaced by the operational focus that Mara remembered from mission briefings when the joke stopped and the work began. Doc, we have been talking as a team. There is more to your story than just March 15th. The Navy declassified 2 other operations we were on together. Chief Voss has the details. Chief Voss nodded. The IED strike on our convoy in August 2013. You remember that one, Doc? Mara felt her back spasm at the memory. A violent contraction of muscles that had been damaged in that exact explosion and had never fully healed, and probably never would. The IED had detonated beneath the second vehicle in their convoy, flipping it onto its side and sending shrapnel through the air in every direction. Mara had been in the third vehicle. The blast wave had thrown her against the interior wall, hard enough to herniate 3 discs in her lumbar spine. The concussion had blurred her vision for 48 hours, and she had crawled out of her vehicle and treated 4 casualties before anyone realized she was injured herself. You treated 4 wounded operators while you had 3 herniated discs and a concussion. Chief Voss's voice was flat with the controlled fury of a leader whose subordinate had been wronged and who had been waiting years for the opportunity to say so publicly. You refused evacuation until every single casualty was stable and loaded onto medevac. That is not in any official report because the mission was classified at the time. But I kept personal records, combat logs that were too detailed for official channels, and that action needs to be part of this story. Logan leaned closer to his camera. And there was that night patrol near Sangin, the one where we encountered the kid. Teenager, maybe 16. Armed with an AK, he could barely hold up. You recognized he was terrified. Recognized that he was not of a committed fighter, but a scared boy who had been forced into a conflict he did not understand. Mara remembered. The boy's hands had been shaking so badly the rifle barrel was tracing figure 8s in the darkness. His eyes were wide with the particular terror of someone who knows they are about to die and cannot figure out how to prevent it. Every operator on the patrol had their weapon trained on him. One wrong movement from either side, and the night would have ended with a dead child and a firefight that could have killed civilians sleeping in the houses nearby. You spoke to him in Pashto. Logan continued. Convinced him to put the weapon down. Convinced him to surrender peacefully. That kid is alive because of your judgment. And we avoided a firefight that could have killed every person in that village. That was just good tactical sense. Mara said it quietly the same way she had said it 8 years ago when Chief Voss had commended her for the decision. Killing a scared teenager does not make anyone safer. It makes enemies of his family and his village and everyone who hears the story. Exactly, Chief Voss replied. That is the kind of judgment that made you irreplaceable on our team. Medical expertise is essential, but knowing when not to use violence. Understanding the human dynamics of a combat situation, reading a person's intentions through their body language in the dark at 50 meters with your own life at stake. That is what separated you from a good corpsman and made you exceptional. And that is what I wrote in my recommendation. Weston adjusted his glasses. Doc, we want to go public with all of this. Not just March 15th. Everything. The IED, the kid, the 6 other operations where you saved lives that Chief Voss has documented. We want to testify about why the Silver Star recommendation was written and why it was justified and why what was done to it was wrong. But we will not do it without your say-so. This is your story. Your choice. There was silence on the call. 4 faces watching Mara through the screen. 4 men who had trusted her with their lives and who now trusted her to decide how those lives would be used in a fight that had nothing to do with Taliban insurgents and everything to do with institutional failure. There is something you all need to know. Mara said it slowly, feeling the weight of each word as it left her. Master Chief Hargrove found evidence that Captain Aldridge downgraded awards for 6 other women besides me. Army medics, Air Force personnel, Marines, all between 2011 and 2014, all with extraordinary combat actions that got reduced to lesser recognition. If we go public with my story, it needs to be part of a larger conversation about systemic bias. It cannot just be about me. Colton nodded. That is leadership thinking, Doc. Not just fighting for yourself, but for everyone who got the same treatment. A new window opened on the call. Iron Hargrove's face appeared gaunt and gray, the cancer consuming him visibly between one meeting and the next. He looked like a man who was measuring his remaining days not in weeks, but in tasks to be completed before the time ran out. Sorry to interrupt, but I have news. I filed a formal request with the Navy Secretary's office for a complete review of Doc Kessler's Silver Star recommendation. Got a response today. He paused. Not for dramatic effect, because he needed to breathe, and breathing had become something that required conscious attention. Lieutenant Commander Catherine Hollowell from Naval Personnel Command will be contacting you directly, Doc. They want to expedite the review process. Timeline is approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Mara said it like a question, though it was not one. The Navy is taking this seriously. The viral attention created political pressure that they cannot ignore. Members of Congress have started asking questions. The Secretary wants to get ahead of the story by addressing it properly and publicly. But there is a condition. Of course there is. They want you to participate in a public ceremony. Full press coverage. Official statement about recognizing female combat veterans. You would become the face of this issue. The person the cameras point at when this story is told. That is a significant ask, and you need to understand what it means before you agree. Chief Voss spoke before Mara could respond. Doc, whatever you decide, we will be there. All of us. If you are going to stand in front of cameras and tell this story, your team will stand beside you. Logan nodded. Nora wants to come too. She has been talking to our parents and our whole family. They all want to be there. To honor the person who saved my life and gave our family a future. Colton was already pulling up a calendar. Just tell me when and where. This is more important than any shift I could cover. Weston said nothing but held up his phone to show he was already clearing his schedule. Iron Hargrove continued. There is one more thing. Captain Aldridge, the officer who downgraded your award. He has requested permission to attend the ceremony. Says he wants to make a public statement. The Navy is asking if you are comfortable with that. The anger was immediate. A hot flare behind Mara's sternum that spread through her chest and into her shoulders. The man who had decided her courage was not worth recognizing now wanted to be part of the ceremony. Wanted to insert himself into the narrative of her vindication. Wanted perhaps to control the story one more time by positioning himself as part of the solution rather than the architect of the problem. She closed her eyes. Breathed. Let the anger move through her without acting on it. A technique her therapist had taught her that worked about 60% of the time, and that she practiced the other 40% with diminishing returns. She thought about what Iron Hargrove had said 3 weeks ago in Conference Room B. That this was bigger than one downgraded medal. That there were other women whose courage had been diminished. That systemic change required confronting the people who created the system, not just surviving it. Let him come. She said it before she was fully certain she meant it. But once the words were out, she found that she did mean them. Not because she had forgiven Aldridge. She had not. Not because she wanted him there. She did not. but because his presence at that ceremony would serve the mission better than his absence. Because the story of one woman receiving a medal she already earned was smaller than the story of the man who took it away, standing up and accounting for what he did. If he wants to speak, he should have that opportunity. Truth needs to be heard from all sides. If he wants to apologize and acknowledge the pattern that helps everyone. If he wants to defend his decisions that tells people who he really is. Either way, the truth wins. Iron Hargrove was watching her through the screen with an expression she could not fully read. Something that might have been pride. Something that might have been sorrow. Something that might have been the recognition of a quality in someone else that you wish you had possessed when it mattered. The call lasted another hour. They planned logistics and discussed strategy with the same focused efficiency they had once applied to mission planning. Chief Voss would gather all his personal combat logs and additional documentation from operations that had been classified until recently. Colton, Logan, and Weston would each write detailed statements covering specific incidents beyond March 15th. Iron Hargrove would continue coordinating with Naval Personnel Command, and Mara would prepare herself for what was coming. After the call ended, she sat in her kitchen in the growing darkness. She had not turned on the lights, and the apartment had slowly surrendered to shadow as the sun set behind the buildings across the street. The screen of her laptop had gone to sleep, leaving only the small green light of the power indicator pulsing in the dark like a heartbeat. Her phone buzzed. A text from Walt Crenshaw, the Marine veteran who had challenged her at the VA office and who had become something she had not expected. An ally with the fervor of a convert. Saw the news coverage. Want you to know I am helping Master Chief Hargrove coordinate with veteran advocacy groups. We are building support for your ceremony and for reviewing other cases. You have got allies, ma'am, more than you know. Another message. Shelby Parrish. I refiled my disability claim today. Used your story as motivation. Already getting better treatment from VA staff. They are asking the right questions instead of challenging my service. Thank you for showing me it is worth fighting even when the system pushes back. Mara set the phone down and walked to her bathroom. She stood in front of the mirror and turned around, lifting her shirt and craning her neck to see the tattoo that had started all of this. The GPS coordinates running along her shoulder blade. The 7 signatures in 7 different hands. The medical cross surrounded by dog tags and empty boots. The scars woven into the design like rivers on a map of a country that only 8 people had ever visited. For 8 years she had hidden this mark. Kept it covered under sweaters and high-collared shirts. Not because she was ashamed, but because it was a private language between her and her team. A bond that did not need external validation to be real. Sharing it with strangers had felt like a violation. Like translating a prayer into a language that stripped it of its meaning. But now it was public. Described in news articles and discussed on television by people who had never seen it and never would. It had become a symbol not just of her service, but of every woman who had served in combat and been told that her contributions did not quite reach the threshold of full recognition. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost did not answer. The reporters had taught her to be suspicious of numbers she did not recognize. But something made her pick up. Instinct, maybe. Or the part of her brain that was still a corpsman, still trained to respond when the phone rang, because the phone ringing might mean someone needed help. Miss Kessler. This is Lieutenant Commander Catherine Hollowell, Naval Personnel Command. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. Yes, ma'am. I have been assigned to review your Silver Star recommendation. I have read the original documentation, Master Chief Hargrove's evidence of systematic bias, and the witness statements from your team members. I want you to know that what was done to you and the other women in similar situations was wrong. The Navy recognizes that and is prepared to act. Mara sat down slowly on the edge of her couch. What is the timeline? 3 weeks. We are organizing a ceremony at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Your team will be invited. Press coverage will be extensive. The Secretary of the Navy wants to make this a statement about the Navy's commitment to properly recognizing all service members, regardless of gender. There is a condition. Hollowell's voice became more careful, more precise. The voice of someone delivering information that had been reviewed by lawyers before it was approved for delivery. We need you to speak publicly about your experience, about the missions, about the award downgrade, about what it means for female veterans broadly. You would be giving interviews and potentially testifying before Congress about military award reform. It is a significant commitment that would extend well beyond the ceremony itself. Mara thought about the 60-plus female veterans who had emailed her with stories that mirrored her own. Thought about Shelby Parrish refiling her claim. Thought about young women considering military service who needed to know that their contributions would be valued and their sacrifices recognized without asterisks or qualifications. I will do it, but on one condition. This cannot just be about me. Captain Aldridge downgraded awards for 6 other women. They deserve recognition too. If I am going to be the face of this issue, we need to address the pattern, not just my individual case. Every one of those women earned what was taken from them, and every one of them deserves to have it returned. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The pause of a government official recalculating the scope of a project that had just expanded significantly. Miss Kessler, that is a much larger undertaking. Reviewing multiple cases, tracking down service members who may have separated years ago, building documentation for each one. Then, it is a good thing Master Chief Hargrove already started that process. He has the documentation. We have the evidence. The question is whether the Navy is committed to actually fixing the problem or just managing the public relations fallout from my story, because I am not interested in being a prop for a press conference. I am interested in justice for every woman on that list. Hollowell's voice changed. The careful precision of a bureaucrat replaced by something warmer. Something that sounded like the voice of a woman who had perhaps faced her own version of this fight at some point in her career, and who recognized in Mara's words an echo of her own frustrations. You are right. And for what it is worth, there are a lot of people at Personnel Command who agree with you. Let me discuss this with the Secretary's office. I believe we can make this work. But Miss Kessler, be prepared for significant media attention. Your story is already viral. When we announce the Silver Star ceremony, it is going to intensify considerably. After they hung up, Mara sat in the darkness of her apartment. She had not turned on the lights, and she did not turn them on now. Outside the window, the sounds of a normal evening continued. Cars passing on the street below. A neighbor's television playing something with a laugh track. The distant bark of a dog that had opinions about the darkness. She pulled up her email and began composing a message. Not to a reporter, not to a lawyer, not to anyone who wanted to use her story for their own purposes. To the 60-plus female veterans who had contacted her with their own stories of diminished service and questioned courage. I am moving forward with the public ceremony to receive the Silver Star that was downgraded 8 years ago. But I want this to be about all of us, not just my individual case. If you are willing to share your stories to be part of pushing for systemic change, please let me know. We are stronger together. And we have been silent long enough. Her phone buzzed one more time. Iron Hargrove. Catherine Hollowell just called me. Said you impressed her with your strategic thinking. Doc, you are not just fighting for a medal anymore. You are building something bigger. Proud of you. Mara looked at the folder on her coffee table one last time. Then she stood up and turned on every light in her apartment. The darkness retreated to the corners and the edges pushed back by the simple act of illumination. She had work to do. A speech to write. A network to build. A ceremony to prepare for. And 47 women whose names she had memorized from Iron Hargrove's documents, 47 women who had earned recognition that was stolen from them by a system that valued conformity over courage. 3 weeks. Then everything would change. She sat down at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began. The morning sun cut through the windows of Naval Air Station North Island's main hangar, with the precision of a surgical instrument illuminating dust motes that floated in the still air like particles of gold suspended in amber. The hangar had been transformed overnight from a maintenance facility that smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid into something resembling a cathedral. 600 chairs arranged in precise military rows across the concrete floor. A raised platform at the far end with a podium bearing the Navy seal. American flags flanking the stage at perfect intervals. Camera crews from 14 news organizations positioned at strategic angles, their equipment bristling with lenses and microphones, and the quiet intensity of people who understood they were about to document something significant. Mara Elise Kessler stood backstage in her dress blue uniform and tried to remember how to breathe. The uniform still fit. She had checked 3 times that morning standing in front of the bathroom mirror in her apartment at 4:30 because sleep had abandoned her hours earlier, and there was nothing to do with the dark except fill it with preparation. The fabric was crisp, the creases sharp, the ribbons aligned with the mathematical precision that military dress regulations demanded. and that her hands remembered how to achieve even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. The Navy Achievement Medal sat on her chest in the position where in approximately 90 minutes, a silver star would replace it. Her hands were shaking. Not the tremor of fear, though fear was present, curled in her stomach like a living thing. This was the fine vibration of adrenaline meeting exhaustion of a body that had slept 3 hours in the past 48 and was running on coffee and cortisol, and the particular form of determination that she had first discovered in a dusty aid station in Helmand Province when a wounded operator was bleeding out, and her body wanted to collapse, and her hands said no. Through the gap in the heavy curtain that separated the backstage area from the main hangar, she could see the space filling with people. Uniforms from every branch of service, civilian suits, press credentials hanging from lanyards. Faces she recognized from television news broadcasts, and faces she had never seen and would probably never see again after today. 600 strangers about to witness either the most important moment of her life or the most public failure she could imagine. The sound of wheels on concrete announced Iron Hargrove before she saw him. His wheelchair appeared from behind a storage container, piloted with the economical movements of a man who had learned to navigate the world from a seated position and refused to let that limitation slow him down. He looked worse than he had 3 weeks ago. The cancer had accelerated its campaign with the merciless efficiency of an enemy that does not negotiate. His dress uniform, immaculate in its presentation, hung loose on a frame that had shed perhaps 20 pounds since the VA office. The ribbons and decorations that covered his chest seemed almost too heavy for the body beneath them, as if the physical weight of 40 years of service was finally exceeding the capacity of the structure that had earned it. But his eyes had not surrendered a single degree of sharpness. They found Mara and held her with the same focused intensity he had brought to their first encounter in that fluorescent waiting room 6 weeks ago. Nervous Doc. His voice was rougher now, each word a negotiation between his will and his lungs, between what he wanted to say and what his body would permit. The oxygen tank beside his wheelchair hissed its constant accompaniment, the mechanical breathing that had become the background music of his diminishing life. Mara attempted a smile. It felt wrong on her face, like wearing someone else's expression. Terrified. What if I fail the speech? What if I say something wrong and it damages the cases of those other women? What if I make this worse instead of better? Doc. His tone cut through her spiral with the clean efficiency of a blade. You kept 3 men alive while the world was trying to kill all of you. You did that with your hands and your training and your voice and nothing else. You can handle a speech. He studied her face. Reading her the way he had read thousands of sailors over 4 decades, the way a man reads weather, looking for signs of what was coming and whether the vessel could handle it. But there is something you should know before we go out there. Aldridge is here. Front section 3 rows back. Gray hair, dress uniform, sitting alone. Mara felt her stomach perform a slow rotation. Captain Warren Aldridge, 70 years old. The architect of a pattern that had diminished the service of at least 7 women over 4 years. The man whose signature on a review board decision had reduced the most significant action of her career to a footnote. She had agreed to let him attend, had even said she wanted him there. But agreement in the abstract and reality in the concrete were separated by a distance that she was only now beginning to measure. Good. She was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The word came out clean and certain without the tremor she felt in every other part of her body. Let him see what he tried to bury. Iron Hargrove's weathered face rearranged itself into an expression she had not seen from him before. Something that looked like pride mixed with something that looked like farewell, though she would not understand the farewell part until later. That is the warrior I remember from those reports. He reached into his jacket with hands that trembled from the cancer's toll on his nervous system and withdrew a single sheet of paper folded twice. The paper was worn at the creases from repeated handling, as if he had opened and closed it many times, reading and rereading what was written there until the words had become part of his internal architecture. This is what matters today, Doc. Not my condition, not Aldridge, not the cameras or the politicians or the reporters who will get half the details wrong and all of the emotion right. Just you and your team and the truth. He held out the paper. Mara took it and unfolded it with fingers that felt clumsy and imprecise, the opposite of the surgical instruments they had been trained to be. 47 names, handwritten in Iron Hargrove's careful script, each one accompanied by a rank a unit and a brief description of the award that had been diminished. Army medics who had saved lives in Fallujah. Air Force security forces who had held defensive positions in Bagram under sustained attack, Navy corpsmen who had deployed with Marine reconnaissance units into territory that the maps labeled hostile and the soldiers labeled hell. 47 women who had proven their courage in blood and fire and been told by the same system that sent them into danger that their blood was somehow worth less than the blood of the men beside them. They are counting on you, Doc. Not just to get your silver star. That is the smallest part of today. They are counting on you to tell the truth about what happened to all of them, to make sure that this ceremony is not just about correcting one mistake, but about acknowledging a pattern that should never have existed. Mara refolded the paper and slid it into the pocket of her dress blues beside her heart, where she could feel its presence against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Through the curtain gap, she could see the front row filling with faces that made her chest ache. Colton Briggs had shaved for the first time in what appeared to be months, his jawline sharp and unfamiliar beneath the dress blues he wore with the visible discomfort of a man who preferred operational clothing to ceremonial costume. He kept tugging at his collar and glancing around the hangar with the situational awareness of someone who had spent years assessing rooms for threats and could not turn it off even in a space filled with allies. Logan Daly sat beside him, broad-shouldered and solid as a foundation wall, his beard trimmed to the nearest approximation of regulation that a civilian could manage. His sister Nora was beside him in an army dress uniform she had clearly retrieved from storage for the occasion, the fabric carrying the faint impression of the box it had been folded in for years. Behind them, an entire row filled with members of the Daly family. Parents, cousins, nieces, the extended constellation of people whose lives had continued because Mara's hands had refused to let go of an artery on a dirt road in Helmand Province 8 years ago. Weston Greaves sat at the end of the row, thin and precise in his uniform, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the hangar lights. He was still the way he was always, still conserving energy for the moments that required it, and letting the rest of the world expend itself around him. And Chief Petty Officer Decker Voss retired, but wearing his uniform as if retirement were a temporary condition, and the Navy might call him back at any moment. His bearing had not diminished by a single degree. He sat at the end of the front row closest to the aisle, with the positioning of a team leader who intended to be the first one standing when the moment required it. 4 other SEAL operators from her deployment filled the remaining seats. 8 men total, her team, her brothers, the ones who had traced their signatures onto her back with Sharpie markers and watched as a teammate with steady hands and an improvised tattoo gun made those signatures permanent. Behind the team, the hangar filled with the supporting cast of what had become a national story. Walt Crenshaw in his Marine field jacket, the skeptic transformed into a guardian who had spent the past 6 weeks coordinating veteran advocacy groups with the same intensity he had once applied to combat operations. Shelby Parrish in her Air Force dress blues, the young veteran who had refiled her disability claim and won a 70% rating, and who now sat in this hangar as proof that one person's courage could create permission for others. Glenn Nolan from the VA office, looking uncomfortable in a suit and tie, the bureaucrat who had questioned Mara's documentation and who had spent the subsequent weeks personally expediting her case with the fervor of a man atoning for a professional sin. And scattered throughout the crowd, visible by their bearing and their expressions, and the way they held themselves, at least 50 women wearing various military uniforms or veteran jackets. The female combat veterans who had responded to Mara's email, who had shared their stories, who had traveled from across the country to be present for a ceremony that was about one woman's medal, but was also about their own unfinished business, with the system that had not yet acknowledged what it owed them. 3 rows back, sitting alone in a space that seemed to expand around him, as if the adjacent chairs were leaning away, Captain Warren Aldridge, 70 years old. Ramrod straight in his dress uniform, his face arranged in an expression of such careful neutrality that it could have meant anything or nothing. He stared at the empty podium with the fixed attention of a man who had been rehearsing something and was waiting for his cue. A Navy lieutenant commander appeared at Mara's elbow. Catherine Hollowell, the officer coordinating the ceremony, carried a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested she was managing 17 simultaneous crises and succeeding at 16 of them. Miss Kessler, we are ready to begin. The Secretary of the Navy will speak first. Then we read the citation. Then your team members give their testimonies. And finally, you speak. Are you ready? Mara looked at Iron Hargrove. He nodded once. A single vertical movement of his chin that contained everything he could not say and did not need to, because they had already said it in the VA office and in phone calls and in the shared understanding of 2 people who knew what the other carried. She looked through the curtain at her team. 8 men in dress blues watching the stage with the focused patience of operators waiting for a mission to commence. Men who had followed her into Conference Room B when she was a stranger being questioned. Men who had signed her body as proof of belonging. Men who were here today not because they had been ordered, but because the bond forged in blood and fire did not dissolve when you took off the uniform. Yes, ma'am. I am ready. The ceremony began with the mechanical precision that the military applies to its rituals, each element timed and positioned and executed according to protocols refined over centuries of practice. The Secretary of the Navy, a career officer with iron gray hair and 3 rows of ribbons, and the practiced ease of someone who had given 1,000 speeches and remembered the important one, stepped to the podium. We are gathered today to correct an injustice that occurred 8 years ago. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Mara Elise Kessler displayed extraordinary heroism on March 15, 2013, in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Her actions on that day and on numerous other operations during her service with SEAL Team 3 merited recognition at the highest level available for combat valor. That recognition was unjustly denied due to institutional bias in the award review process. Today, we rectify that failure, and we commit to ensuring it never happens again. The formal citation was read aloud by a Navy captain, whose voice carried the words across the hangar with the gravity they deserved. Sustained enemy fire from multiple positions. 3 critical casualties treated simultaneously under direct hostile fire. Continuous medical intervention while personally exposed to enemy weapons. Actions that directly resulted in 3 lives saved and mission success achieved. Each phrase precise and measured, and entirely inadequate to convey what had actually happened on that road outside Sangin, because military language was designed to document facts, and facts alone could never capture the full dimension of what it meant to hold a man's life in your hands while the world tried to take it from you. Mara stood at attention beside the podium, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance where the hangar wall met the ceiling. Using every gram of military bearing she had ever learned to keep her face composed, and her body still, and her emotions contained in the internal space where she stored the things that were too large to let out in public. Then, Chief Decker Voss stepped to the microphone, and the ceremony transformed from institutional to personal. In 22 years with Naval Special Warfare, I served with hundreds of corpsmen. Doc Kessler was the best I ever worked with. His voice carried through the hangar with the absolute authority of a man who had earned the right to make that statement, and who would not have made it if he did not mean it with every fiber of his being. Not because she was female, not to make any political point, but because when rounds were flying and men were dying, she was the one person on that team I knew, beyond any doubt, would bring them home alive. Her medical expertise was exceptional. Her courage under fire was extraordinary. And her judgment in the most chaotic and terrifying circumstances I have ever experienced in my career was without flaw. He turned from the microphone to look directly at Mara. His eyes held the same expression she remembered from the day he had handed her the team patch at the end of her first deployment and told her she had earned it. Pride. Certainty. The acknowledgement of one professional by another. Doc, that silver star is 8 years late, but it is not 1 minute less earned. You saved my boys. You proved yourself every single day you served with us. And no bureaucratic failure and no coward hiding behind a review board will ever change what you meant to our team. Colton Briggs spoke next. His voice lacked the polished cadence of Chief Voss's decades of leadership, but it carried a raw authenticity that hit differently. The testimony of a man speaking from inside the memory rather than about it. March 15th. I was bleeding out from femoral artery damage and abdominal shrapnel, going into shock. Vision tunneling down to a pinhole. Everything getting dark and quiet in a way that I understood meant I was dying. And then I heard Doc's voice, calm as a Sunday morning. Colton, I need you to hold this pressure dressing while I work on Logan. Can you do that for me? I could barely see, could barely think, but her voice was so steady and so certain that I believed her when she said I would be all right. She started an IV one-handed while maintaining arterial pressure on Logan with her other hand and her knee. That is not just medical skill. That is the kind of courage and competence you cannot train into someone. You either have it when the world falls apart, or you do not. Doc had it. Logan Daly approached the microphone with the visible effort of a man who had spent 8 years building walls around a memory and was now choosing to dismantle them in front of 600 people and 14 cameras. For 8 years, I did not talk about what happened to me in Afghanistan. Not to my sister Nora, who was sitting right there, not to my parents, not to anyone. I told my family I got dinged up and changed the subject every time they asked for details. I let them believe it was minor because the truth was too heavy to hand to people I loved. He gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles whitening. The truth is, I was dying on a dirt road outside a village I cannot spell. A rifle round through my subclavian artery, the kind of wound that kills you in minutes if no one is there to stop the bleeding. And someone was there. Doc Kessler was there. She was already treating Colton when I went down, already managing one critical casualty. And she got to me in seconds, put her hands on my wound and did not take them off for 38 minutes. He paused, not for effect, because the next part required him to go somewhere he had not gone in 8 years, and his body was resisting the journey. I woke up in the surgical ward at Leatherneck 3 days later. A nurse told me what happened. Told me that the corpsman who treated me had maintained direct pressure on my artery for the entire transport. That she had refused to let the flight medic take over because she said she could feel the pulse under her fingers, and she was not willing to risk even a 2-second transition. That she had talked to me the entire time, even though I was unconscious, because she believed I could still hear her. His voice dropped lower. I asked the nurse who it was. She said it was a female corpsman attached to my team. A woman who weighed 130 pounds and who had kept 3 men alive while being shot at. I already knew who it was. I just needed to hear someone else say it, because what she did that day was so far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect of another human being that I needed confirmation it actually happened. He looked at the audience. The Navy decided that what Doc Kessler did was worth a Navy Achievement Medal, the same award they give for outstanding performance during a training exercise. That decision was made by men who were not on that road, who did not feel the dirt kicked up by incoming rounds, who did not hear her voice cutting through the chaos telling us to stay alive. They made that decision from behind desks in clean offices, and they made it because she is a woman. That is the simplest and most damning truth I know. Weston Greaves testified quietly, his words measured and precise, each one selected with the deliberation of a man for whom language had become more difficult, and therefore more valuable. I do not remember most of March 15th because of my traumatic brain injury. That day took my memory of itself from me. But the medical team at Leatherneck told me that Doc Kessler's neurological assessments during transport under fire probably saved me from permanent brain damage. She knew exactly what to monitor, knew exactly how to manage a TBI patient while simultaneously keeping 2 other men alive. That expertise, combined with her refusal to give up on me even when I was unconscious and unresponsive, that is why I am standing here today. That is why I can speak these words at all. Each testimony built on the last. Layer upon layer of evidence, not the documentary evidence of paperwork and citations, but the living evidence of men whose existence was proof of what Mara had done. The audience sat in a silence that had weight and texture, the silence of 600 people absorbing truth that was being delivered not as argument, but as fact. Even the camera crew's professionals trained to observe without reacting showed emotion on their faces. This was not a political story or a controversy or a debate about gender roles in the military. This was 4 men standing in front of the world and saying she saved us and she deserved better than what she got. Then it was Mara's turn. She stepped to the podium with legs that felt unreliable but held, placed her hands on the wooden surface and felt its solidity beneath her palms. Looked out at 600 faces arranged in rows that stretched back into the shadows of the hangar. Found her team in the front row. 8 men watching her with expressions that needed no translation. Found Iron Hargrove in his wheelchair at the edge of the stage oxygen tank beside him, giving her the smallest nod. A gesture so economical it might have been invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. But Mara was looking, and she saw it, and it was enough. She found Captain Warren Aldridge 3 rows back. His carefully neutral expression had not changed. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his spine straight, and his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that could have been hostility or remorse, or something in between that did not have a name. 6 weeks ago, I walked into a VA office to file a disability claim for injuries sustained during my 2nd deployment to Afghanistan. I was told that my service could not possibly be real because women do not serve with SEAL teams. She let the words settle into the silence. The veteran who challenged me was a Marine with 3 combat tours. He was not being malicious. He was protecting the integrity of military service, making sure that false claims did not diminish real sacrifice. I respect that impulse even when it was directed at me. Her gaze moved across the crowd. 600 faces, 50 of them belonging to women who had served in combat and carried their own versions of this story. So I showed him proof. A tattoo on my back created by my SEAL team at Forward Operating Base Leatherneck in Afghanistan. GPS coordinates marking the exact location of the March 15th mission, the date, and 7 signatures of the men I served with traced in permanent ink by their own hands. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded paper with 47 names pressing against her fingers. But this ceremony is not just about me or my Silver Star. It is about the 47 women whose names I carry right now. Army medics who saved lives in Fallujah. Air Force personnel who defended bases under attack. Navy corpsmen who deployed to the most dangerous places on Earth. Women who proved their courage and were told it was not quite enough. Her voice strengthened. Finding its register. Finding the frequency that carried conviction without aggression. Certainty without arrogance. We did not serve for medals. We served because our teammates needed us. Because our country called us. Because the person bleeding in the dirt beside you does not care about your gender when you are the only thing between them and death. But recognition matters. It matters because it tells the next generation that their contributions will be valued, that their sacrifices count, that they belong. Movement in her peripheral vision. 3 rows back. Captain Warren Aldridge was rising from his chair. The motion drew eyes from across the hangar heads turning to watch as the elderly officer stepped into the aisle with the deliberate movements of a man who had made a decision and was now committed to executing it regardless of consequence. He walked toward the platform, each step measured and unhurried, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing carrying the accumulated authority of 4 decades in command. The hangar fell into a silence so complete that Mara could hear the soft hiss of Iron Hargrove's oxygen tank from 15 feet away. Aldridge stopped at the base of the platform steps. He did not climb them. He stood at the bottom and looked up at Mara, and in his eyes, she could see the internal architecture of a man confronting the most difficult moment of a long career. Whatever mask of neutrality he had been wearing in his seat was gone now, replaced by something raw and unfinished and painfully human. Miss Kessler. His voice carried without amplification, a voice trained over decades of command to fill spaces larger than this. A voice accustomed to delivering orders that sent people into danger and decisions that determined the trajectory of careers. Now delivering something else entirely. My name is Captain Warren Aldridge, United States Navy retired. I was the senior officer on the review board that downgraded your Silver Star recommendation in 2013. He turned to face the crowd. 600 people, 14 cameras, every lens and every eye fixed on him. I came here today not because I was invited, though I was, and I am grateful for that generosity. I came because I owe Miss Kessler and every person in this hangar a public accounting of what I did and why I did it. His voice did not waver, but it carried a weight that made each word sound as if it were being extracted from somewhere deep inside him, pulled up from a place where it had been stored under pressure for 8 years, and was now being released into the open air where it could finally be examined in full light. In 2013, I read Hospital Corpsman Kessler's after-action reports. I read 8 witness statements from SEAL operators describing her actions as the most courageous medical intervention under fire they had ever witnessed. I read Chief Voss's recommendation, calling her the bravest corpsman he had served with in 2 decades of special operations. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion, that this young woman had performed with extraordinary valor, and that the Silver Star was the appropriate recognition. His voice cracked, a single fracture in the wall of composure he had constructed for this moment. And I voted to downgrade her award to a Navy Achievement Medal. Not because her actions failed to meet the standard, they exceeded it, but because I was afraid. Afraid of political backlash, afraid of controversy, afraid that recognizing a woman for combat valor would draw attention I did not want to manage and questions I did not want to answer. He paused. The silence in the hangar was absolute. I chose cowardice. I chose bureaucratic convenience. I chose my own comfort over the honor of a woman who had more courage in her hands than I demonstrated in my entire career on that review board. And I did the same thing to 6 other women between 2011 and 2014. 6 heroes whose extraordinary actions were diminished because I decided that their gender was more important than their valor. He turned back to Mara, and she could see tears in his eyes. Not the performative emotion of a public figure managing a narrative, the uncontrolled response of a man who had spent 8 years carrying a weight he could no longer bear, and who was setting it down in the only place where setting it down could mean something. Miss Kessler, I cannot give you back those 8 years. I cannot undo the doubt my decision planted in your mind about whether your service was truly valued. I cannot erase what I did to you or to the other women whose courage I diminished. He came to attention, his body straightening with the muscle memory of 40 years in uniform, and he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute that trembled slightly, but did not fall. But I can stand here today and say with absolute certainty that you earned this silver star. You earned it with blood and skill and valor that exceeded anything I ever accomplished in my entire career. And I am deeply and profoundly sorry for denying you that recognition. Mara stood at the podium looking down at the man who had shaped 8 years of her life with a single vote on a review board. The man whose decision had followed her through every VA office and every job interview and every sleepless night when she wondered if the men who signed her back had been wrong about her. The anger was still there. It would probably always be there in some form. You do not erase 8 years of consequence with one public apology, no matter how sincere. But she was also looking at a 70-year-old man standing alone in front of 600 people and 14 cameras admitting that he had failed, that he had been afraid, that he had chosen wrong. And she understood what that cost because she understood fear and she understood what it meant to act in spite of it. She returned the salute, her hand rising with the precision that the Navy had trained into her muscles and that her muscles would carry for the rest of her life. Captain Aldridge, thank you for your honesty. It takes more courage to admit error publicly than to make excuses privately. You have given closure not just to me, but to the other women whose awards you reviewed. And you have shown that change does not happen through anger alone. It happens when people have the courage to admit mistakes and commit to fixing them. Aldridge lowered his salute, nodded once, and returned to his seat with the measured steps of a man who had just shed something heavy and was still adjusting to the lighter weight. The Secretary of the Navy stepped forward with the silver star in its blue presentation case. Mara stood at attention as he unpinned the Navy Achievement Medal from her chest and replaced it with the 5-pointed star hanging from its red, white, and blue ribbon, the weight of it settling against her uniform like an anchor finding the bottom, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed for 8 years, like proof. Then something happened that was not in the program. Chief Decker Voss stood from his seat in the front row. His voice rang through the hangar with the full authority of a SEAL team leader issuing a command. Team, attention. All 8 of Mara's operators rose in unison. The movement was synchronized with the precision of men who had trained together and fought together and bled together until their bodies operated as extensions of a single will. They stood at rigid attention facing the platform, where Mara stood with a silver star on her chest and tears she could no longer contain running down her face. Chief Voss's voice filled the hangar. Hospital Corpsman, Second Class Mara Elise Kessler. On behalf of SEAL Team 3, past and present, and every operator whose life you saved and whose mission you made possible, you are one of us. You have always been one of us. And no review board, no bureaucratic failure, and no amount of institutional cowardice will ever change that. Hoo-yah! 8 hands rose in perfect synchronization. 8 salutes rendered with the fierce precision of men who meant every millimeter of the gesture. 8 warriors standing in public and declaring before the world that this woman belonged to them and they to her. And the bond between them was written in something more permanent than ink. Mara returned the salute through tears that blurred the hangar into a wash of light and color, and the faces of men she loved with the ferocity that only shared trauma can produce. The cameras captured the image that would appear on every news broadcast by evening. Female combat medic in dress blues, silver star gleaming, tears on her face, being saluted by the SEALs she saved. The tattoo partially visible above her collar, the edge of a signature, and the first digits of GPS coordinates peeking above the fabric like a secret that had finally been given permission to be known. The ceremony concluded with formal remarks from Catherine Hollowell about the Navy's commitment to reviewing all 47 cases of potentially downgraded awards. Several female veterans stood to share their own experiences. The event expanded beyond its original scope, becoming not just a medal ceremony, but a public acknowledgement that something had been broken, and that fixing it would require more than one morning in a hangar. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed in clusters of conversation and emotion, Iron Hargrove wheeled himself to a quiet corner, where Mara stood alone for the first moment since the ceremony began. He looked exhausted. The event had drained whatever reserves the cancer had left him, and his face was the color of old paper, translucent and fragile, and marked with the blue tracery of veins that the flesh could no longer conceal. "Doc, I need to tell you something." His voice was barely above a whisper. She knelt beside his wheelchair without hesitation, bringing her face level with his. Her dress blues would wrinkle against the concrete floor, and she did not care. Wrinkles could be pressed out. Some things could not. "I have got maybe 3 months left. Maybe less. The tumors are in my liver now, and the doctors have stopped talking about treatment options and started talking about comfort care, which is their way of saying, we have lost this fight, and now we are just managing the retreat. But I can go knowing I did one right thing in my final months. One thing that mattered. Master Chief, who did more than one thing right. You served 40 years with honor." He waved that off with a hand that trembled but still carried the authority of the man it belonged to. "Maybe. But the thing I am proudest of, the thing I will carry with me into whatever comes next, is what we did together these past weeks. Tracking down those 47 women. Filing the formal complaints. Getting every single case put into the review pipeline. That is legacy. That is leaving things better than I found them." He reached behind his wheelchair and produced a notebook. It was small, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, but it had been handled so often that the cover was soft with age, and the pages had the rounded corners of paper that has been turned and turned again by fingers searching for specific information. He held it out to Mara. "Contact information for all 47 women. Their names, their units, their award details, everything I could find. The Navy is reviewing their cases now because of what you started, but they need someone to keep pushing. Someone who understands what they went through because she went through it herself. Someone who will not let the bureaucracy slow walk these reviews into irrelevance." Mara took the notebook. It weighed almost nothing, a few ounces of paper and ink, but the responsibility it represented pressed down on her with a force that had nothing to do with physical mass. "Master Chief, I do not know if I am the right person for this. You are the most qualified person alive, Doc, because you did not do this for glory or attention or political advantage. You did it because it was right. You did it because 47 women were told their courage did not count, and you could not accept that. That is what leaders do. They see what is wrong, and they fix it. Not because someone orders them to, because their conscience will not let them do otherwise." His eyes were fierce despite his physical weakness, burning with the particular intensity of a man who understands that every word might be among his last, and who has decided to spend them on the things that matter. "Promise me, Doc. Promise you will fight for every name in that notebook the way you fought for your teammates on that road outside Sangan. Promise you will use this platform to create real change, and not just accept your medal and walk away." Mara looked at the notebook. 47 names. 47 women who had earned something that was taken from them. 47 missions still to complete. "I promise, Master Chief, for you and for every woman on this list, we will make sure their service is properly honored." Iron Hargrove's face creased into a smile, genuine and unreserved. The smile of a man setting down a burden he had carried for 8 years and finding that the ground beneath it was solid enough to hold. "That is my Doc, always thinking about the team. Always thinking about the mission." He released her hand and settled back in his wheelchair. His daughter appeared at his side, a woman in her 40s with her father's eyes and the careful attentiveness of someone who understood that each day with him was borrowed time. "Now go talk to those reporters. Tell them about the 47. Make sure this story does not end with your medal. Make sure it is the beginning of something that outlasts both of us." Mara stood. Iron Hargrove's daughter began wheeling him toward the hangar exit. At the door where the San Diego sunlight poured in like liquid gold, he raised his hand. Not a formal salute, something more personal, a gesture between two people who had fought a battle together and won, and who both understood that winning did not mean the war was over. Mara returned it, her throat too tight for words. Then he was gone, wheeling out into the bright afternoon. She would learn 47 days later from his daughter's phone call at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday that began like any other that Master Chief Roy Iron Hargrove had died peacefully at his home in Coronado with his daughter beside him and his Navy jacket across his lap. He had lived just long enough to see the Navy officially approve reviews for all 47 cases. His final words, his daughter said through tears that were audible across the phone line, were, "Mission complete. Tell Doc she did good." The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a morning when the autumn air carried the smell of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic on Memorial Drive. Full military honors. A flag-draped casket carried by 6 sailors in dress whites. A 21-gun salute that echoed across the headstones like the final punctuation of a sentence 40 years in the writing. Mara stood with her SEAL team as taps played across the cemetery, the notes hanging in the cold air with the particular clarity that brass instruments achieve on autumn mornings when the humidity is low and there is nothing between the sound and the sky to diminish it. The flag was folded with precise triangular folds by hands that had practiced the ceremony until it was perfect and then practiced it again because perfect was not good enough for this. It was presented to Iron Hargrove's daughter, who received it with both hands and held it against her chest the way her father had held his duty. Close and permanent, and without apology. In Mara's pocket, the notebook. 47 names. 47 missions. Iron Hargrove's final gift and his final order. She turned from the grave and found her team waiting. All 8 men standing together in their dress blues, arranged in the loose formation they had used on patrols, close enough to support each other, spaced enough to survive. Colton reached her first. His embrace was hard and brief, the embrace of a brother who expresses love through compression rather than words. "Proud of you, Doc. You stood up there and told the truth even when it was terrifying. That takes the same guts it took on that road in Helmand." Logan was next, his arms careful around her, mindful of the back that still carried the damage from the IED blast and would carry it for the rest of her life. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for giving Nora and my family closure. And thank you for standing up for those 47 women. You are making a difference that goes way beyond one medal." Chief Voss gripped her shoulder and looked at her with eyes that still carried command authority even in grief. "Iron Hargrove was the best of us, Doc. And he chose you to carry this forward. That tells you everything you need to know about what he saw in you." Walt Crenshaw appeared at the edge of the group, the Marine who had challenged her in the VA waiting room and who had spent the subsequent weeks building a network of veteran advocates committed to supporting the 47 cases. His face was solemn but certain. "Ma'am, I have been coordinating with advocacy groups across the country. We have resources and representation lined up for every woman on that list. When the reviews come through, and those women will have people in their corner. You started this. A lot of us are going to finish it with you." Shelby Parrish found Mara as the crowd at the grave began to thin. "Miss Kessler, I got my disability rating approved, 70%. The VA is treating me like a veteran now, instead of like someone who wandered into the wrong building. That happened because of you, because you showed all of us that fighting the system is not hopeless. That truth eventually gets heard if someone is brave enough to keep speaking it." Mara spent the rest of the morning accepting condolences and commitments in equal measure, each conversation reinforcing the same truth that Iron Hargrove had understood from the beginning. This was never about one medal. This was about a system that needed to change and would change because enough people had decided to push. As Arlington emptied and the autumn sun climbed toward noon, Mara stood alone at Iron Hargrove's grave for a final moment. The fresh earth was dark against the green grass. The headstone was temporary, a small marker that would be replaced in the coming weeks with the permanent stone that would carry his name and rank, and years of service for as long as stone endured. She pulled the notebook from her pocket and held it for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and began composing a message. "To all 47 women whose names Iron Hargrove had written in his careful script, my name is Mara Kessler. I just received the Silver Star that was downgraded 8 years ago due to gender bias. Master Chief Roy Hargrove gave me your contact information because your cases are now under official review. He spent the last months of his life fighting for you, and he asked me to continue that fight. I want you to know that you are not alone in this. We are stronger together, and we have been silent long enough. Hooyah." The responses began arriving within minutes. Women who had been waiting years for someone to acknowledge what had been done to them. Women who had given up hope. Women who had carried the weight of diminished recognition the same way Mara had carried hers in silence and in doubt, and in the persistent question of whether they had truly earned what the system told them they had not. Now they knew, and now someone was fighting. Mara walked out of Arlington into the autumn afternoon. Her team was waiting at the cemetery entrance, standing together the way they always stood. The way they had stood in Afghanistan and at the ceremony, and at this funeral, and at every moment that mattered. Ready, together. She slid her hand into her pocket and felt the notebook there, its soft cover warm against her fingers. 47 names. 47 women. Iron Hargrove's last mission, now hers to complete. They had asked for proof. She had shown them truth written in ink and scars. And now that truth was doing what truth does when it is finally spoken aloud and heard by the people who need to hear it. It was changing things. Not quickly, not easily, not without resistance and setback, and the particular frustration of pushing against institutions that preferred inertia to accountability, but changing, measurably and permanently. Because 47 women had names, and those names were in a notebook. And that notebook was in the hands of someone who had promised a dying man she would not stop until every one of them received what they had earned. Mara joined her team, and together they walked toward whatever came next.